Hello, everyone. How are you? It's a pleasure to be here to present about the new stuff of GXTest in this GeneXus 18 version. In particular, we're going to talk about DevOps and all the different tests that you can run during the development cycle. A couple of years ago, available tools were absolutely independent from the knowledge base. Normally, you would get an export from the KB, and from that, you started getting a lot of tests, which we call regression tests. With agile methodologies, this has substantially changed. Let us remember that the main change of teams is that quality is no longer responsibility of one single team, but rather that it's a responsibility of everyone. As a matter of fact, you have a lot of teams that don't have only the testing role in the team. That means that teams don't adopt these methodologies because they are trendy or because they want to get a certification, but rather because the methodological and cultural change associated to it really entails some great benefits. In particular, in terms of speed and quality. That's why I want to tell you why this GeneXus 18 version is ideal to begin to adopt some of the most common DevOps practices in different teams and projects. I'm going to be focused on testing, but if you want to learn more about automation that you can apply to builds or releases, feel free, and I would really recommend it to take a look at Jose Lamas' talk, where you will find some nice complement to this talk. In the last 3 years, we have been strongly dedicated to integrating testing in the development lifecycle. Nowadays, GXTest is 100% integrated in the development environment. It is really well integrated with GX Server so that you can share the tests with different team members. And at the same time, all tests are designed to be run on continuous integration servers such as Jenkins or any other, which allows us a management of tests and results that is much more modern and friendly with the DevOps practices. So nowadays we have tests which are absolutely integrated to the IDE. Also, we have auto generation for all tests. In other words, those objects in our KB that have the business logic encapsulated, it's really easy to just right click and create tests. It's going to give you the main structure for all tests and also the structure for all the necessary data. And in the last couple of versions, also all tests are written in GeneXus code, which makes it easy to understand the different modifications that have been made. We also deliver information on the associated code coverage, and we've worked a lot to make tests run faster. They are 3 times as fast as the first versions. And of course, all tests can be grouped in different suites that may be executed, of course, in continuous integration servers. Of course, all these features, when they run in a pipeline, you can get HTML reports that are really comprehensive amongst many of the benefits. But well, what's new? It's that we have a new type of test that we are announcing in this GeneXus 18 version. Last year, we conducted a number of interviews and surveys with our users, and this was the most requested feature, and that's why we prioritize that in our roadmap. After the GeneXus 18 version, then you will be able to test services. Let's see an example directly in the KB. So here we have a very simple procedure, which is exposed as a web service. It's a REST web service. So we want to run a test for this. Typically, you would use a third-party tool and you would create input and output data. Here I'm going to do exactly the same as I would do with any other GeneXus object. So I'm going to right-click, generate test. And this is going to generate, on the one hand, all the execution for that test, and on the other, all the data structure that I need to run that test. Typically, any web service that you run, the first thing that you're going to validate is the status code of the operation. And then, depending on the input, I'm going to validate different areas. For example, in this case, I need to validate that a certain account has a positive balance, for example, to make a transaction. So I'm going to run a super simple test that to check whether or not an account has available balance. As you can see, all the code generated is 100% GeneXus. And you can use data providers and the objects that you use for the rest of tests to run this. Now, let's imagine that after you run these tests, you want to share that so that you can run that in a different KB, for instance. Or let's say that you want to modify the procedure and you want to add some security to it. This is, of course, a typical modification. Just by going back to the test, which you can do in the same way that I've just done, you right-click on the object and you click on Create REST Test. It is going to ask you again what data you want to have as input. You can auto-generate some data, and automatically you will be able to include, for example, GAM as part of your authorization. So in this case, it's generating code so that by using different users and passwords, you can get the authentication through GAM and run this feature, for example, with a user that has some permits. And I want to have, for example, in this case, a 200, or a user that doesn't have a permit to get a forbidden in return or something like that, which takes us to our second announcement, the database mocking. This feature is also something that we've been working on for the last couple of years, and it's incorporated in the beta channel of GeneXus, and we can say that today it's complete. As you may know, GeneXus applications are strongly data-oriented, so one of the main difficulties that you may have when it comes to sharing your tests and running your tests in other environments is precisely having a data set that corresponds to the running environment. So if you had the possibility to become independent from those data and not have to set that up for each environment, that's going to give you a lot of speed, and you're going to be able to reuse much of the work that developers do and the different members of the team do, so that those tests just go in keeping with the development lifecycle. So let's show you how we would do that in the same example with the same KB. So let's assume that we want to try the logics of this procedure, which happens when a client or an account has enough balance to make a transfer. So that's a very simple example. We're going to be trying just two cases. Case number one, for account one, I want to validate that yes, they do have balance to transfer $200, and account number two does not. So we have an auto-generated test. We know that account one has 1,000 and account two, the balance is 0. So the test should be okay. But what happens here, for instance, if I run this test in a different database, or if another team member downloads the test from the KB, makes a modification, and wants to check whether or not this is still working? Well, as I was telling you, to make these data independent for these tests, you can use this function, because this feature will allow you to record all the sentences that will go to the database and create a cache. So let's run this test for GeneXus to save all those sentences in a cache file. So now, after running the test, that we see that it passed, we can see that the very test has been added or attached a mock data file, which is a JSON file. That file is also going to be part of our tests and our KB, and you can send that to the server, and every single time that you deploy tests, these files will also be deployed. You don't need to understand how this works in the background, but just FYI, you can edit the file and you can manage it as you please. Okay, so on top of what I've shown you so far, we've added a couple of very interesting features and improvements to the product. In particular, one of the most requested ones was to be able to import data from CSV, which is also available after the GeneXus 18 version. And the question that I ask myself here is, do we really manage to make DevOps easier and friendly to implement? Well, that's probably a question that you need to ask yourselves. We believe that there's always work left to be done, and for us, feedback is paramount. Remember that we are sending surveys on a regular basis to our clients and our users. We have a design partners program whom I'd like to thank, because these are companies that work together with us by giving us a lot of very interesting feedback. So thanks a lot to everyone. I'd like to invite you, those of you that want to be a part of these events, to be a part, because feedback is always welcome and it helps us to give different priorities to our roadmap. So as a summary, I can say that the pyramid is now complete. We can automate UI tests that allow us to simulate user actions. We can now do service tests that are extremely handy for mobile applications and for service applications. We already had the possibility to do tests on the different objects in the KB that encapsulate logics. And finally, the database mocking feature that is going to precisely allow us to reuse a lot more all the tests that we have and to share them and run them in different environments and continuous integration servers. So download this GeneXus 18 version and add all this automation to your tests that will allow you to incorporate these practices and make a difference. Thank you so much.